Let's go to our panel now. Joining me now from Hobart, Australia is barrister Greg Barnes. He's an advisor to Julian Assange and Wikileaks. In Sydney is investigative journalist Andrew Fowler. He's the author of the book Shooting the Messenger, Criminalising Journalism. And in Washington, D.C., we have Nate Snyder. He was a Homeland Security counter-terrorism official under the Obama administration. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Greg, is this an attack on press freedom?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that. If you look at the nature of the charge, if you look at the way in which the United States have pursued this matter so relentlessly for 9 years, and if you look at the response of reasonable people around the world, including many journalists in Australia, there's no doubt that this sends a very clear message, and that is if you assist a whistleblower and you reveal information which the United States does not want you to reveal, the United States and its allies, then you can expect the United States will come after you. There's absolutely no doubt this is a highly political misuse of the criminal law.
So, Nate, are you one of those unreasonable people who disagrees?
I do disagree. I think if you look at the prosecution and the charge as it sits now, it's not about publication of the documents that WikiLeaks is known for. It's about the actual hacking attempt, the espionage, and the dangerous release of information in conjunction with Chelsea Manning as well. And then also to add on top of this, you're looking at further allegations from the Swedish government potentially looking at the allegations of sexual assault and rape. So I think this is, when you look at it from a national security perspective from the U.S., yes, obviously politics are going to play a role slightly, but I think this is pretty cut and dry. This was an attack on our country. It was weaponization of information to compromise our national security.
Andrew Fowler, when we add to that the fact that the Ecuadorian president is saying that Assange was using the Ecuadorian embassy in London as a center for spying, would you accept that this is more than just a case of somebody releasing information that a government didn't like and being persecuted for it?
I think it's important to focus on the fact that in the first place, Assange was being charged with something that happened in 2010. And the allegation that's made against him is quite specifically dealing with the fact that he's actually helping to protect a source. This is protecting Chelsea Manning. So the idea that somehow he's involved in doing something which is in breach of the Espionage Act, which is in fact implied in the charge, is completely erroneous. He's actually doing his job as a journalist. And to suggest otherwise, as our colleague in Washington was suggesting, I think is disingenuous.
Okay, Nate, let's just sort of forget Assange's personality for the moment and some of the stuff that he's accused of having done within the embassy walls and so on for the past 7 years. Let's go back to the very genesis of everything. Was it not in the public interest for the US voting citizens and others to know that when the US military denied killing civilians in Iraq, this video came out and showed otherwise? Was that not in the public interest?
Well, when you talk about the public interest here, I mean, let's first take a step back here and look at WikiLeaks if we were looking at the real history here of what Julian Assange has done. Calling him a journalist, I think, is a misnomer here. You're talking about an individual who had a platform, who worked very closely, allegedly, as a Russian fence, using that platform to give guise to would-be Russian hackers to exploit information and then use the platform to post sensitive information. When you're talking about public interest, there are mechanisms within U.S. government, within the intelligence community, within freedom of information Act.
This was at the very beginning, and you're bringing up the Russians and so on, right? And again, this is later on, right? I'm saying right at the very beginning, I did one of the first interviews with Assange at the very beginning when WikiLeaks came out with that video. They called it collateral murder, right? And Chelsea Manning had said that she went through the different protocols and nobody was listening. And this is why this was released. And we found that what was released on the video, that what we saw as an international public contradicted what the DOD had said. And there was a lot of soul searching within the United States afterwards because innocent people were killed. So at the genesis of it all, was that not of value, Nate?
I think of value, I think you need to look at, you're looking at, do the ends justify the means? And I think in this case, the means justify the means in this case. And so We did have a national dialogue once that information did get out, but let's not sugarcoat the fact here on how it got out. It was done illegally. It provided an opening to adversaries. It compromised their national security. And, you know, when you're looking at it, this information was put in classified nature, and the release of it actually endangered the lives of our men and women on the front line. So I think that is, you know,
so let's get a response from Greg and then Andrew. Greg, beyond that initial video, especially with the embassy leaks and the cables, the barrage or the torrent, if you like, of cables that came afterwards, it compromised US national security. It put people's lives in danger. Do you buy that?
No, but that's what the security state always says. They do it in this country too. I mean, I've done these cases where, you know, they constantly hide behind national security and compromising our people. It's nonsense. There's absolutely no evidence that the release of the material in 2010 and subsequent releases of material, by the way, have compromised national security. Just to pick up a point, though, that's been made by a colleague in Washington, he says it was done illegally. Most whistleblowers are forced to act in defiance or in breach of the law in order that the truth will out. That is the nature of whistleblowing, and they do it because no one within the system will assist them and deal with the matters. That's the nature of whistleblowing, and long may it live. There are times when the breaching of the law, and we're dealing with a case here in Australia, which is Andrew and I both know about, called Kaleri, which is similar, where revelations in that particular case about Australia spying on East Timor, that would never have surfaced if people had played by the black letter law. And it's fundamentally important to understand that's the nature of whistleblowing, and it's important. I mean, the Pentagon Papers would never have got out if we applied a black law letter of a black letter view of the law.
Andrew,
I can't actually hear Greg at the moment, but just let me say this: that the whole question of whether or not the release of that information over that period of 2010 put people's lives at risk. The Defense Secretary at the time, Robert Gates, said that no lives were put at risk as a result of that material being released. And in fact, he went on to say that the United States was simply embarrassed, only embarrassed by the release of that information. And the only people who really lives were put at risk during this whole fiasco were the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the work that Assange and WikiLeaks did to expose what have been called war crimes. Certainly they were mass killings, and certainly there were allegations about assassination squads in Afghanistan, and certainly in Iraq. Those are the things that really needed to, I think, be taken into account. And Assange did was do a good job as a journalist in that particular instance.
Andrew, I want you to address one thing for me before I let you go. There is a general feeling among many people in the industry, for a lot of us who covered this at the beginning and as it evolved over the years, that maybe WikiLeaks started out as one thing that might have been somewhat admirable, but descended into something else. And when we look over the years, there were examples, for example, of Saudi women's personal data being revealed on WikiLeaks that might have put them in danger. We look at the Russian emails, the hacking of the Clinton servers, and so on. Would you agree that there's a semblance of truth to that?
So WikiLeaks should have actually kept that material secret because it aided Trump to be elected. And my point as a journalist is that the public had a right to know that the internal squabbling inside the DNC produced Hillary Clinton, the candidate, and that Bernie Sanders was disadvantaged. I think that was public right to know.
Okay. Andrew, let me thank you here. I thank you so much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Let's bring in Mark Zaid now. He's a national security attorney who has represented whistleblowers. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Mark, does Julian Assange fit the definition of a whistleblower who's worthy of good representation here?
Not in my view, and I've been doing this for 25 years. I mean, and I agree. I don't think he's a journalist either. He has a platform. He's a publisher. And if that was what he was being prosecuted for, then I could understand some concerns that people could have, but that's not. It's a very narrowly tailored criminal allegation. But we've never looked at the members of the press, even were he to be considered to be a journalist or a publisher. We've never considered them to be the whistleblower. It's always been the individuals who have brought the information to them. And even in that case, by the legal definition, Chelsea Manning is not a whistleblower because she went outside the system. We can discuss and debate, and lots of people do, obviously, as to whether or not going outside the system still makes you a whistleblower generically, but legally speaking, she would not be a whistleblower because she wouldn't be entitled to the protections the law affords.
Right. Mark, the Ecuadorians are saying they're not getting anything in return. This is a rational decision from their perspective, and they're sort of pushing Assange into the hands of, well, UK authorities and then US authorities for extradition. Is there any evidence throughout this entire process for you, Mark, that Assange is being politically persecuted?
I mean, as my colleague in DC said, there's always a little bit of politics that comes into any type of prosecution, even though there may be career prosecutors who are deciding it. You know, the news reports have obviously demonstrated that Ecuador and Assange have their own personal issues going back and forth. It cost Ecuador millions of dollars for them to house him. They clearly were getting fed up with his antics. He sued them. It's kind of difficult when you bite the hand that feeds you and not expect a reaction. But of course, anything going on between Ecuador and Assange, or that did, is not relevant to what the United States is involved in or the United Kingdom. And at least from what the reports are, the one thing that Ecuador wanted, and this is understandable, lots of countries ask for this, is if there is going to be an extradition, the death penalty wouldn't be applied.
Right.
And this crime that's been charged does not carry the death penalty. In fact, it only carries maximum of 5-year penalty. And I highly doubt that there'll be any charges that would even come close to the death penalty being applied. But apparently there were assurances that there would be no death penalty ever.
Greg Barnes, he's facing extradition. Do you still think there's a way to stop it?
Yeah, the Australian government, as a citizen who is highly unlikely to get a fair trial in the United States, who furthermore will suffer at the hands of one of the most brutal prison systems in the democratic world, there is sentiment within this country, and we saw it in relation to the case of David Hicks, who ended up in Guantanamo Bay, where Australians won't tolerate one of their citizens being mistreated in that fashion. And I think there is some pressure in Australia, and particularly if a Labor government is elected in the May 18 election here, which is a less conservative party, that we might see some action in relation to this matter. The other point I'd say, of course, is that to think that Ecuador wasn't pressured by the United States is a nonsense. Of course it was pressured. To think that the United States doesn't put some pressure on the United Kingdom is a nonsense. And we know for a fact that in relation to Australia, because I've been dealing with this case now for 7 or 8 years, that the Americans simply rely on Australia's good relationship with Washington for Australia not to make a fuss about the matter. But I think you might find that the sentiment in this country in relation to the United States has changed markedly since Trump was elected, and there is some domestic political pressure building in this country for Australia to get involved in this matter.
Okay, Nate Snyder, you worked for the previous administration.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think about what kind of trial Julian Assange will get under the Trump administration. I'm not in any way implying that the Trump administration would somehow be able to influence the courts, but you have a president who initially said, I love WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks, I love WikiLeaks. I know nothing about WikiLeaks recently. That's the zeitgeist. Is Assange going to get a fair trial?
I think the quick answer to that, I believe so, is yes. Just 2 points to backtrack on some of the comments that were made earlier. One is, I think the other person joining in from Washington, D.C. made some great points, on Assange as well. I think we need to look at him as a chameleon, a cult of personality who wants to shift and change shapes when is most convenient. I think that doesn't take away that he's an actual disruptor and not necessarily a journalist. Second, to the person's comments about the Australian government in relation with the U.S., I want to remind folks that the US and Australia are part of the Five Eyes Alliance. It is one of the strongest alliances in the world that goes back to World War II, and we work very closely with the Australian government. And I think any kind of pressure coming from the Australian government, I don't think is there. Some of the information that has been leaked by WikiLeaks also had implication to the national security of Australia as well. Going to your question directly, yes, I believe, regardless of administration, looking at this, whether it's the Obama or now the Trump administration, I believe he would get a fair trial. I think we need to look specifically at what he's being prosecuted. Again, to mention, it's the actual hacking, it's the espionage, it's not going back to the allegations and what had Assange had done at the very beginning of the founding of WikiLeaks. This is very clear on the exploitation, the collaboration with Chelsea Manning, the hacking that went into potentially get information, and then looking at the sort of periphery of potential influence with the Russians or collaboration with the Russians as well. So I think all that aside, I think if it were still the Obama administration, I think he would still get a fair trial. He's going to get a fair trial, and I think the verdict's going to be the same. Okay, and just some housekeeping before I ask you my next question, Mark. So we don't know for sure if the Swedish are still going to pursue what they dropped a while ago on issues of allegations of sexual assault and rape. That might re-emerge. The extradition hearing will be on May the 2nd. Now, as far as I understand, I'm not a lawyer here, Mark, there is a US-UK extradition treaty that says someone cannot be extradited from the UK for political offense. That might be used as part of the defense. So a UK judge could throw a spanner in the works, and there might also be the chance for Assange to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. So with that in mind, Mark, is it still possible that we won't see Assange going to the US?
It's certainly always possible. And you accurately cite to the political offense exception. That is a very common clause within extradition treaties. In this particular case, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, and I'm by no means an expert on British law, but it's going to be more difficult, generically speaking, because the crime for which he is accused of the attempted hacking into Defense Department computers would be a crime in the United Kingdom as well. No one could hack into MI5, MI6, the domestic and external intelligence agencies there as either. Now, you also indicate that he could appeal. So it is unlikely that we're going to see him here in the United States for many months. It is possible this could even stretch into next year. And, look, courts are sometimes unpredictable, and we're dealing with multiple foreign systems here. If Sweden enters into the picture, that may throw things into a little bit of sort of a monkey cage, but we'll see. And I do agree. I think he would get a fair trial here in the United States. It's possible they may file a motion to move the case outside of the Eastern District of Virginia because of perhaps unfair pretrial publicity. I could see that as a motion. Don't know if it would be successful. But I think one thing that I would end on is everyone always seems to assume, at least around the world, that a fair trial means that the individual would have to be acquitted or found innocent. That's not what a fair trial is. A fair trial is that the process along the way gives the defendant the opportunity to properly defend themselves. And a fair trial can result in a guilty verdict.
Okay. And people like Greg and Andrew believe that he should not be on trial in the first place. That's where the fault line is. And this is why it's so fascinating. Julian Assange and everything that follows him doesn't seem to go away for now. But gentlemen, we'll keep a close eye on it. Let me thank you, Nate Snyder, Greg Barnes, and Mark Zaid, and earlier Andrew Fowler. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for joining us.